All right, the global pandemic ruined any fancy internship plans I had, so instead of that, I'm going to spend my summer reading books and talking about them. I'm kicking off my summer reading with Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms because I've never read any Hemingway before. A little bio and background. Ernest Hemingway was born in 1899 and he killed himself in 1961. He was a real man's man. He liked to hunt and stuff. As a young man, he worked for the Kansas City Star, which is said to be where he developed his iceberg style, which is minimalistic and straightforward in a pretty punchy way that reinforces his masculine legacy. He moved to Paris in 1921 after he served on the Italian front in World War One as an ambulance driver, which is the basis for A Farewell to Arms. Afterwards, he joined the artistic community of modernist expatriates like Gertrude Stein and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Modernism was a movement happening in the late 19th century and early 20th century in which poets and authors were actively trying to do what Ezra Pound later described as making it new. It was characterized by stuff like the stream of consciousness styles of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, the rejection of the romanticism of the 19th century and other experiments in form and style. It was originally pretty idyllic and optimistic because of all the progress happening in science and other areas, but it took a pretty dark turn after World War One, and that's what a lot of traditional modernist literature is born out of. So this artistic culture of experimentation and despondence after the First World War sets the stage pretty well for A Farewell to Arms, which was published just 3 years after Hemingway's debut novel, The Sun Also Rises. Okay, plot summary time. This book is told from the perspective of Frederick Henry, who will be referred to as Henry because that's what I called him in my mind while I was reading this. He's an American serving as a lieutenant in the Italian army. He's introduced to a British nurse named Catherine Barclay by his promiscuous surgeon friend Rinaldi. Catherine's fiance was killed in battle, so they hit it off, and it's pretty clear from the beginning that their affair is motivated by their respective wartime hardships that they've both endured. Henry's looking for an escape from the actual war that he hasn't found through the prostitutes available, like Rinaldi has, whereas Catherine is dealing with the grief of losing her fiance. While Henry and his other drivers are working on the Italian front, he goes to get his team macaroni and cheese, and he's the victim of a mortar attack in which his knee is badly wounded and one of his men dies. And so he has to get treated. He's going to Milan to get treated, and Catherine is going to. That's the end of book one. Book two focuses on Henry's time in Milan. He hangs out in the hospital, gets it on with Catherine for the first time, and hears what a few doctors have to say about his knee. Henry and Catherine continue their facade and lie to each other about things like previous lovers, and they pretend to be married. And Henry can eventually walk around Milan where he drinks a lot and meets a douchebag named Moretti who also serves in the Italian army and loves to brag and talk about his decorations and make fun of these opera singers. Throughout all of this, the Allied forces are not doing well. Henry is supposed to get 3 weeks leave after he's healed, but he drinks so much that he gets jaundice and has to go back right away because the nurses are really mad at him. Before he does, he and Catherine get a hotel room, and Catherine does this weird thing where she kind of feels like a whore and feels ashamed about that, but also says she wants to do something sinful. She's also pregnant, which I think explains some of the weird tension happening there because the realness of her pregnancy and a baby kind of throws a wrench in their happy go lucky relationship. And book two ends with Henry leaving Catherine in the pouring rain, which isn't a good sign. Book three is very bleak and dark. Henry goes back to the front. Rinaldi says the war is killing him, and everyone's spirits are so low that they don't even make fun of the priest anymore, which is one of their favorite things to do and was a focus of book one. There's a big retreat happening, which I believe took place after the Battle of Caporetto, in which the Italians just got their butts kicked. So Henry is part of that, and he's leading his men, and there's a few sergeants that are kind of hitching a ride with them. And they take these secondary roads because the retreat is all blocked up. They wind up stuck, and when that happens, the sergeants try to run off, and Henry shoots at one of them, which is insane. When they try to rejoin the Italians in the retreat, one of Henry's guys is shot and killed by the Italians that they are trying to rejoin because they're so paranoid. Later, another one of his guys just surrenders himself as a prisoner of war. And after that, military police start yanking officers out of the retreat and shooting them for retreating. So Henry has to escape this by jumping into the river and hopping on a train. Book 4 sees Henry meeting a lot of people who recognize him as somebody who's abandoned his job and as a dissenter of the war. And they offer to help him, and they're very sympathetic to this, which is part of the reason this book was controversial and banned in Italy. He stays with one of the opera singers from earlier that the guy was making fun of, meets back up with Catherine, and plays pool with this old guy, Count Greffy. Then the bartender he's friends with tips him off that he's going to be arrested and gives him his boat so he and Catherine can row it to Switzerland overnight. So they do that, finesse their way into getting the Swedish authorities to let them stay in the country and have a nice life for a while in the mountains as they wait for the baby. There's still a tension going on between them, though, because Catherine wants to do things like cut her hair to make her look more like Henry and be basically one person, and Henry kind of doesn't want that. Then Catherine goes into labor. Both she and the baby die, and Henry leaves the hospital in the rain. So that's the ending, and it's an ending that Hemingway obviously thought about a lot, which is evidenced by the massive amount of alternate endings that he wrote. Moving on, I want to talk about the title because Hemingway wrote a bunch of titles like he wrote a bunch of endings. I found an article on the title and how it was chosen for free thanks to the pandemic that I'll link below if it's still available. The article talked about the George Peele poem, which was written in like the 1550s or something, that Hemingway it shares the title. It's called A Farewell to Arms. The poem's dedicated to Queen Elizabeth and deals with a soldier who learns to be a husband again after war. It's very respective of religion and duty and faith in the government and the system. So Hemingway is using this pretty ironically and undercuts basically all of those ideals, those romantic ideals in the first chapter, in which he describes pretty much a wasteland and even characterizes the Italian king as small and insignificant. So he's just immediately giving readers what amounts to a middle finger to the romanticization of old with regards to battle. Next up is Hemingway's iceberg theory of writing. This novel is not what you would typically consider hard to read. It's straightforward and matter of fact and journalistic. And that is the iceberg theory of writing, in which Hemingway saw himself just presenting readers with the facts, which is the tip of the iceberg, and letting them figure out the rest on their own. When I first read about this in the introduction to the book, I had this misconception that Hemingway's writing was going to be static and neutral, but that's not the case. It is concrete, but it does things and serves a textual purpose like any other more abstract style of writing. And one of the main things that you realize as you read the novel is that the style fits thematically. This is pretty explicitly stated in chapter 27 after Henry returns to the front and says, abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hollow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. End quote. That's the iceberg theory in action, and one of its strongest functions. It describes the unfortunate in a very direct way that doesn't allow you to do anything but deal with the terrible things that are happening. You can see this when Hemingway writes that Imo, the soldier who was shot by the paranoid Italians as they tried to rejoin the retreat, looked very dead. This style just aids the novel big time in its turn away from romanticism. One of the most important themes of this book is what I've decided to call earthly indulgence. And I'm talking about the lack of moderation that's shown throughout with Rinaldi's sex drive, Henry's drinking, Catherine's like passion, and Moretti's bragging, etc. Lots of this indulgence leads to bad consequences, like Rinaldi getting syphilis, Henry getting jaundice, and Catherine's death. But I think the point that is being made here is more complex than too much of anything is too much or all of these earthly pleasures are temporary. Those things might be true also, but I think the bigger point being made is something like love is hard and war makes it a lot harder. Henry and Catherine fly too close to the sun by rushing into this reckless relationship as a result of the effects of war, and they both pay dearly for it. There's also an interesting risk gradient that is going on, which is brought in, I think, through Count Greffy's character. He says that old men don't grow wise, they just grow careful, and that it's not wise to value the one that he loves or throw these birthday parties that he throws, which are apparently a pretty big event. And this brought up the idea to me that to be happy and live a pleasant life like Count Greffy does, you have to find the level of risk that you're comfortable with for the earthly rewards you're given. Greffy seems content with the risk he runs and caring so much about something like his birthday parties, even though he says that it's not wise to do so. And you can contrast this a little bit with Henry and Catherine's absolute obsession with each other, which in comparison is very risky. The last big thematic thing I wanted to bring up is the issue of masculinity in the book. And one thing I'm trying not to do with this is just regurgitate the SparkNotes talking points. And thankfully, when it comes to the issue of masculinity, that is not hard to do because I think SparkNotes gets it wrong. They make masculinity in the novel out to be some kind of tough guy zero-sum game, with Hemingway showing a preference for the kind of man they call domineering, supremely competent, and swaggeringly virile. There are definitely characters who fit this mold, like Moretti, but I think the only time you could actually make a case that this macho archetype is really being celebrated is when Dr. Valentini fixes Henry's leg. Other times, those more red-blooded features of characters are, to me, they were pretty thoroughly rejected. Henry shuts down Rinaldi, who kisses Henry and calls him baby, by the way, in chapter 25 when he tries to talk about whether or not Catherine puts out. And likewise, Henry's often in the corner of those characters who are made fun of by the manly men, like the priest, who he really respects despite not being religious, and the opera singer who he later stays with and who helps him out. The one moment in the novel where Henry himself appears to be this determined and militaristic person is when he shoots at the sergeant who's running away, which comes just after he tells one of his men not to steal a clock from the abandoned farmhouse that they're staying in. And this, like most of the story, shows not a scene of manly heroism, but the breakdown and ambiguity of moral consistency that war can invoke from those virile men. It was jarring and not good to see Henry in that position. Obviously, there's way more to say about A Farewell to Arms than what I covered. You could talk about the rain symbolism or the allusions made to the Bible or Shakespeare or H.G. Wells, etc. But these are some of the main things that I took from my reading. So yeah, A Farewell to Arms, Ernest Hemingway, necessary read.